You walk through the town market carrying a long wooden staff with a red cloth tied to the top. People see you coming and immediately step back. Mothers pull their children close. Merchants turn away. A man who was walking toward you stops, reverses direction, and crosses to the other side of the street. You are not a criminal. You have not threatened anyone. You are just doing your job. But that job marks you. It separates you from everyone else. You stop at a house on the edge of town and knock 3 times on the door. No one answers, but you hear movement inside. You mark the door with a red X using paint you carry in a small tin. That X tells everyone who passes that this house is dangerous. That death lives inside, and your job is to make sure no one forgets it. You move to the next house, then the next. By the end of the day, you will have marked a dozen homes. And every person inside those homes knows that once you mark their door, they are as good as dead to the rest of the world. This was the reality in Europe and colonial America during the 1600s and 1700s, an era when infectious disease killed more people than war, famine, or violence. Plague, smallpox, typhus, and cholera moved through populations like wildfire. There were no vaccines, no antibiotics, no real understanding of how disease spread. Medical knowledge was limited and often wrong. When an outbreak started, the only defense authorities had was isolation. Keep the sick away from the healthy. Quarantine entire families. Lock them in their homes and wait for the disease to run its course. But someone had to identify infected households, mark them publicly, and enforce the quarantine. That job fell to plague wardens or pestilence officers, men hired by local governments to walk through infected districts, find the sick, and make sure they stayed isolated. The job paid better than most labor. But there was a reason for that. Plague wardens were despised, feared, and constantly exposed to the deadliest diseases known at the time. Most did not survive more than a year. His name was Thomas. He was 38 years old when he became a plague warden. He had been a carpenter, a decent one, but work had dried up. A harsh winter and poor harvests meant no one was building new homes or repairing old ones. Thomas had a wife and 2 young daughters. They were living in a single rented room, surviving on bread and whatever cheap vegetables they could afford. When the local magistrate posted a notice looking for wardens during a smallpox outbreak, Thomas considered it. His wife begged him not to apply. She knew what the job meant. She knew people who took it rarely came home. But Thomas looked at his daughters, their hollow cheeks and thin arms, and he knew he had no choice. He went to the magistrate's office and signed the contract. The magistrate handed him a staff, a tin of red paint, and a list of streets to patrol. Thomas asked if there was any training. The magistrate told him to avoid touching the sick directly and to report any households showing symptoms. That was it. Thomas started the next morning. The work was straightforward but brutal. Thomas walked through assigned districts looking for signs of illness. Families were required to report infections, but many hid them out of fear. So Thomas learned to watch for other signs. Houses with windows that stayed shuttered, doors that were not opened, neighbors who whispered and avoided certain streets. When he suspected a household was hiding illness, he knocked on the door and demanded entry. The law gave him that authority. If he found someone sick inside, he marked the door with a large red X and nailed a notice beside it that read quarantine. From that moment, no one in that house was allowed to leave. The warden arranged for food and water to be delivered, but often those deliveries were irregular or forgotten. People inside quarantined homes were essentially trapped, and the mark on their door told the entire town that they were infected, dangerous, and probably dying. Thomas did this day after day. He marked homes. He enforced quarantines. He watched families scream at him from windows, begging to be let out, and he turned away because those were his orders. The physical demands were constant. Thomas walked miles every day through crowded, filthy streets. He climbed stairs in tenement buildings where dozens of families lived in tight quarters. He entered homes where the sick were lying in their own waste, feverish and delirious. He had to get close enough to confirm symptoms, which meant breathing the same air, standing in the same rooms, touching the same door handles. The staff he carried was supposed to keep people at a distance, but it did not protect him from infection. He wore a cloth over his mouth sometimes, but he knew it was mostly useless. He just had to hope he would not get sick. And every night he went home to his wife and daughters, terrified that he might be bringing the disease with him. He washed obsessively. He burned his outer clothes when he could afford to replace them. But the fear never left. He lived with the knowledge that every day at work might be the day he became infected. Thomas stopped being seen as a person. He was the plague warden, the man who marked doors, the man who condemned families to isolation. People hated him. They blamed him for their suffering even though he was just following orders. Shopkeepers refused to serve him. His landlord told him to leave because other tenants were afraid. Thomas moved his family to a shack on the outskirts of town where no one would see them. His daughters stopped going outside because other children threw rocks and called them plague carriers. His wife stopped speaking to neighbors because they would not speak to her. Thomas had taken the job to save his family, but the job was destroying them in a different way. They were alive, but they were isolated, hated, and terrified. And Thomas carried the weight of every door he marked, every family he trapped, every person who cursed him as he walked away. Think about that. Imagine being hired to do something that keeps your community safe, something necessary and essential, and being despised for it. Imagine watching families beg you not to mark their door, knowing that mark is a death sentence, and doing it anyway because you have no choice. Could you carry that? Could you live with the hatred and the guilt? And if you were desperate enough to take that job, what would it do to you? The risks were enormous. Thomas was exposed to infectious disease every single day. Smallpox, the disease he was tracking during his first assignment, killed roughly 30% of people who contracted it. Thomas entered homes where multiple family members were covered in pustules, their skin blistered and oozing. He stood in rooms where people were dying, and he breathed the air they exhaled. He touched door frames they had touched. He walked through their homes, and then he went to the next house and did it again. Disease was not the only danger. Families sometimes attacked wardens out of desperation. Thomas was assaulted twice. Once, a man whose wife and children were sick tried to stab him with a kitchen knife, screaming that Thomas had no right to trap them. Thomas fought him off and reported the incident, but the man was not punished. Authorities understood the desperation. Another time, a group of young men ambushed Thomas in an alley, beat him, and stole his staff and paint, thinking that would stop him from marking more homes. Thomas reported to the magistrate the next day. With a black eye and bruised ribs, he was given new supplies and sent back to work. One case stayed with Thomas forever. He marked a house where a young mother and her 3 children were sick with fever. The father was healthy but was required to stay inside under quarantine rules. A week later, Thomas returned to check on them. The father was standing at the window, his face hollow and broken. He told Thomas through the glass that his wife and all 3 children had died. He had been locked inside with their bodies for 2 days, waiting for someone to come remove them. No one had. The food deliveries had stopped. He was starving and surrounded by corpses. Thomas reported it immediately, but it took another day for a body removal team to arrive. By then, the father had stopped responding. When they opened the door, they found him dead as well. Not from disease, from despair. Thomas marked that house as clear and moved on. But he never forgot the look on that man's face. But here is what most people do not realize. Plague wardens were often immune survivors. Many of the men hired for the job had already survived smallpox or plague earlier in their lives. Authorities knew that survivors were less likely to contract the same disease again, so they specifically recruited them. Thomas had survived smallpox as a child. He still had scars on his face from the pustules. That was one reason the magistrate hired him. So, while Thomas feared infection, he was actually safer than most people. But he did not tell his family that. He did not tell his neighbors. Because if people knew that plague wardens were often immune, they might not fear the disease as much. Fear was a tool that kept people obedient during quarantines, and Thomas was part of that system, whether he wanted to be or not. Now think about this. During recent pandemics, people were asked to stay home, wear masks, and isolate when sick. Many refused because they felt their freedom was being violated. But centuries ago, families were locked inside their homes by force, with armed guards ensuring they could not leave. Plague wardens enforced those rules. Does that make you think differently about modern public health measures? Does it make you wonder whether we have learned anything at all? Most plague wardens lasted less than a year. They either became infected and died, or they could not handle the psychological weight and quit. Thomas lasted 2 years. That was longer than almost anyone. But by the end, he was unrecognizable. He had lost weight. His hair had gone gray. He barely spoke. His wife said it was like living with a ghost. He would come home, sit in the corner, and stare at nothing. His daughters were afraid of him. He had nightmares every night, waking up screaming about doors marked with red X, about families trapped inside, about bodies piled in rooms with no one to bury them. He started drinking to quiet his mind, but it did not help. The images were always there. Thomas's final assignment was during a particularly severe outbreak. He was sent to a district he had not worked before, a place where the infection rate was so high that entire streets were under quarantine. He marked house after house, door after door, until his paint ran out. He returned to the magistrate to request more supplies. The magistrate told him to take a day off. He looked exhausted. Thomas refused. He said if he stopped, even for a day, he would not be able to start again. So he took the paint and went back. That night, he developed a fever. By the next morning, he had the telltale rash. Thomas had contracted typhus, a different disease from the one he was tracking. His partial immunity to smallpox meant nothing against typhus. His wife tried to care for him, but she was terrified. She reported his illness to the authorities. A warden came to their shack and marked the door with a red X. Thomas died 3 days later. His wife and daughters survived. They buried him in a mass grave outside the town. No marker, no ceremony, just another body among hundreds. Society needed people like Thomas to control disease outbreaks. Without wardens enforcing quarantines, infections would have spread even faster. Entire towns could have been wiped out. Thomas and men like him were the front line of public health in an era when medicine could do almost nothing. They identified the sick. They isolated them. They prevented the disease from reaching everyone else. But society hated them for it. They were necessary and despised, essential and avoided. Thomas gave 2 years of his life to that work. He marked hundreds of doors. He condemned countless families to isolation, and it killed him. There were thousands of plague wardens throughout history. Most died from disease or violence. Their names were not recorded. Their sacrifices were not acknowledged. They were just tools used by authorities to manage death. The job eventually disappeared. Advances in medicine made quarantine less necessary. Vaccines were developed. Disease became less deadly. Public health systems improved. But that took centuries. The men who worked as plague wardens during the worst outbreaks had no support, no recognition, and no hope that things would improve. Thomas was one of them. He took the job to feed his family. He did the work because someone had to, and the work destroyed him. Thomas is gone now. The doors he marked have been repainted or torn down. The houses where he enforced quarantines have been rebuilt or demolished. But the principle remains. When disease threatens a community, someone has to enforce the rules that keep people safe. Someone has to be the person everyone hates. Thomas was that person, and he paid for it with his life. If you think being a plague warden was the worst job in history, there were others. Jobs that demanded even more. Jobs that broke people even faster. Jobs that still exist today in forms we refuse to see.